Today we're headed back to the series that we started last week on Elijah. It's called Prophet of Fire and Rain. And these stories about Elijah, we're studying them because they are powerful stories. They're packed with incredible power. We're going to read some powerful stories today. But what's great about these stories is they're not just about power. They really apply to our lives in very practical ways. And I know they're going to speak to you today. Last week, I started by explaining to you the setting for Elijah, that he lived in Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel was split at this time between a southern and a northern kingdom. And at this time, they had a king named Ahab. And Ahab, he married a woman from a different kingdom, somebody who had different values than he did. And Ahab started worshiping her gods. And in particular, he worshiped Baal. And Baal was the god of rain and dew. Baal required human sacrifice. People would, in the ancient world, sacrifice their own children to Baal. He built a temple for Baal. He built an altar for Baal in the capital city. He also built a pole for the worship of the goddess Ashtoreth, an Asherah pole. And there was also foreign worship that was going on there. And what Ahab was doing is he was trying to basically change the religion of the Jewish people through these actions. And as it was such a dark thing, as it was such a really horrible thing to worship Baal and all the things that went along with it, God sent Elijah into the scene. And Elijah comes to King Ahab and he tells him it's not going to rain or dew until he says so. Now that's quite a claim, but of course it attacks what Baal is supposed to be about, because Baal is the god of rain and dew. But it's God's way of making it clear that he's still in control, no matter what Ahab and Jezebel said. And that's kind of, and so then after Elijah tells Ahab this, he runs off and he hides by this brook called Kerith. And he drinks from the brook, and ravens bring him food and water twice a day. They bring him bread and meat twice a day. He drinks from the brook. And then we pick up the story where we left off last week. 1 Kings 17:7. You can look on the back of your bulletin at your notes or in the app. It says this: "But after a while the brook dried up." We talked about that last week. "For there was no rainfall anywhere in the land. And then the Lord said to Elijah, 'Go and live in the village of Zarephath.'" Now, in the story, like I talked about last week, we're not finding that Elijah is going to, just because the brook dried up, it doesn't mean that God's abandoned him or he's going to starve to death or die of thirst. He's simply changing the way that he's going to provide for Elijah. And so he tells him to go to Zarephath, but this is a very strange instruction from God, because Zarephath was a Phoenician city. It was near the city of Sidon. Sidon is the capital of the kingdom that Jezebel is from. And so he's sending Elijah to Zarephath, a place where everyone worships Baal, to have his needs met. And undoubtedly, the story of Elijah has already spread. The story of why there's this drought has already spread. But God says to him, "Listen, I've instructed a widow there in Zarephath to feed you." Also strange instructions, because widows in the ancient world, they didn't have any way to make money. Widows couldn't own property. They had no legal rights. They were dependent on their families to take care of them. And so this is what happens. He says, go ahead and go there, and I'll take care of you. And I just want for you to notice that things may be changing for Elijah, but God doesn't change. And basically, this is the first principle I want for you to go ahead and take note of there in your notes. It's this: sometimes things change. And in fact, life is an exercise of transition, one thing after another that you have to let go of. Often things that you think that you could have held on to forever, you eventually have to let go of them. And some of us are good with change, and some of us, we're stubborn about change. But Elijah, he responds in a way that's instructive for us. He hears what God says, even though it seems like a strange route for him to get his needs met. And this is what it says in the next verses, 10 and 11. So he went to Zarephath, and as he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks. And he asked her, "Would you please bring me a little water in a cup?" Now, on a normal day, this might be kind of a strange request of a stranger. Would you bring me a little water in a cup? But this is in the middle of a drought, right? It's such a drought that the brook that Elijah was sitting by dried up. And he shows up and he asks her for water. But not only does he ask her for water, he kind of goes further than that. This is where when I read this story, it seems a little bit rude of Elijah. Not only is water like worth as much as gold at these times, he says to her, it says as she was going to get it. Maybe it's like some of you guys do sometimes. You say, "Could you get me a drink?" And then you say, "Oh, while you're at it, could you also bring me a snack?" That's what Elijah does. It says, as she was going to get it, he called to her, "Bring me a bite of bread too." Now, things are bad. This woman doesn't have anyone to take care of her. She has no rights. She doesn't own her own property. And in that desperate situation, they're in the middle of this drought. In that desperate situation, he says, "Hey, give me some water." And then he says, while you're up doing that, also bring me some bread. And this is an unreasonable ask from Elijah. It's not fair in some ways. It doesn't fit what seems to us like should be the thing that God is basically asking of this woman. Because remember, when God gave the instructions to Elijah, he said, "I've already talked to a widow for you." We don't know how God did that, but somehow he let this widow know that a prophet was coming. And there's a principle for us to take from this today, and it's this. God sometimes makes an unreasonable ask. Sometimes God asks us for things that really don't seem reasonable. We couldn't have planned on that. We couldn't budget it. We couldn't have saved for it. And yet God sometimes asks for us to give to him in a way that costs us far more than we think we can afford. But I want you to be clear about this. Sometimes we can think that God is limited by our resources, but God is never limited by our resources. But he can be limited by our generosity or lack of it. He's not limited by this widow's resources. And listen to how she answers him. She says, "I swear by the Lord your God," not my God, it's your God, "that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. I don't have anything to give you. My resources are totally tapped. I have only a handful of flour in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug, and I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal. And then my son and I will die." We're at the very end. But Elijah said to her, go back please, one slide. But Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid." Now that's real easy to say when you're not down to the very last of what you have. But Elijah, he's learned some things about receiving from God while he's been there at the brook, receiving his food from those nasty birds. And then it says this. It says, "Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first." Again, Elijah seems a little bit rude here. Make it for me first. You know, your son, you'll be fine, but give me the bread first. And then he said, then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. Wow. God asks unreasonable things sometimes. You know, this goes beyond this woman's logic. And I just say this, sometimes following God's will doesn't always make sense to your human logic. And here Elijah seems to be saying also, you know, hey, make it for me first and you'll be okay. Do it for me first and you'll be okay. And that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in sometimes. Maybe you listened this morning to the missionary and then you heard me encourage you to give an offering to the missionary. I want you to know I'll do it too. I'll be giving an offering to the missionary. Maybe you thought, I don't have anything to give them. But I want you to pull this principle away from this story today, something that fits us no matter where we are or who we are. God can do so much more with the little we have if we will give it all to him. God can do so much more with the little that we have if we will give it all to him. I want you to be clear. What you think is just enough for you, God can use it to bless you and somebody else. And then the story goes on. I love it. Verse 14. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. Many early Jewish teachers, they tie this promise to Psalm 37. It says, once I was young and now I'm old, yet I've never seen the godly abandoned or their children begging for bread. This widow, you can imagine, here's this promise. Hey, you know, fix the bread for me first. Do the thing first that God told you you'd have to do. And you're going to make it through this drought. You're going to live through the famine that's going to wipe out so many other people. And you know, you can just imagine the widow kind of saying, now you tell me. Now you tell me. It would have been a lot easier for her to obey if she'd known this ahead of time, right? Like any of us would make a deal with God. If God came along and said, you know, be generous to me, obey me, give me everything you've got, and it will go well with your kids. I've known people with children who are sick, and they would give anything to see their child healed. And if they could make a deal with God ahead of time, they would do it. They'd say, God, I'd give you anything if you'll just make it right. And if they knew they could have a deal like that, they'd give it. But you know what? That's not how God works. That's not how obedience to God works. This is the principle I want you to pull away. Obedience precedes blessing. Obedience precedes blessing. Blessing doesn't come before obedience. We get it backwards, don't we? We say, if you give me the new job, God, then I'll tithe. Give me the new job, God, give me a raise, then I'll give something to that missionary. If you give me what I'll need, I'll give it to you, but that's not the way it works. Obedience comes before blessing. The story goes on. It says, so she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. What happened here? We don't know exactly what happened here, but we know that a miracle happened here. She only had enough for one last meal for her son and her, and then they were going to die. But instead, she made the food for Elijah first. And look how the story goes on. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. Now, I think this is how the miracle happened. It's not that God provided enough flour up front so that she could make it through the rest of this famine. And by the way, this famine lasted 3.5 years. And we don't know how much of that famine was gone already, but maybe 6 months was already gone because the brook dried up. And so she seemed to have enough flour every single day to feed her and her son and Elijah, because Elijah moves in to the house. And the thing is, she's experiencing this miracle of providence, this miracle of God providing for her, I think, every single day. In other words, she goes to bed at night and she's run out of oil and flour. She gets up the next day and God has done a miracle. God has given her just enough for that day, and then just enough for the next day, and then just enough for the day after that, and the day after that. It happened hundreds of times for her. She saw this miracle of providence happen maybe 1,000 times in her house. It happened because she gave the rest of what she had to the prophet. You know, when you trust God with everything, God provides in amazing ways. There have been times in my life where God has asked me for some unreasonable things that I argued with God about, sometimes for years, only to find that when I gave him everything, there were miracles that followed. Here's the principle I want you to understand. Miracles grow out of sacrifice. Miracles grow out of sacrifice. For this woman, this is the ultimate moment of trust. This is the ultimate moment. She's got to decide whether or not she's going to believe that God can take care of her better than she can take care of herself. And in fact, that's what trust is. Trust, here's a definition for trust. Trust is when I have the sense that God can take better care of me and what I have than I can. And worse. And finally, he died. In case you're wondering, the Hebrew for this word died is died. He just stopped breathing. His heart stopped beating. He passed away. And if you're like me, you read this story and you think, well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if God had enough power to provide enough food day after day to provide for these people in the middle of a drought and a famine, why did this kid have to become sick? Didn't God have the power to keep the kid healthy? Couldn't he keep them alive? You know what? This is just as serious as it gets. When we read this story, we somehow think God's maybe become unfair. He's unfair in this situation. I want you to take note of a principle I think we can pull from this. That in the midst of all these miracles that this woman is experiencing day after day, these miracles of providence, it's an important principle for us to recognize, and that's this: sometimes the worst things happen on the heels of some of the best moments. Sometimes some of the worst things happen on the heels of some of the best moments. Sometimes in your life, things are going absolutely great at the job, in your relationships, in your finances, in your health. Everything seems to be going right, and then something horrible happens. That's what happened to this lady. The story goes on. Verse 18, her son dies. Then she said to Elijah, "O man of God, what have you done to me?" She's asking a question that we all ask. When bad things happen, we start almost immediately to question and blame God. When bad things happen, when we've been betrayed, when we've been let down, when we feel the pain, when we're told that we're sick and we're going to die, we start asking immediately, God, what are you doing to me? And she says, have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son? In other words, you know what, Elijah, I really don't think that you're for me. I really don't think your God is for me. You've come here just to go after me, just to wreck me because of how bad I am. You know, she's been living in the miraculous provision of God every single day for hundreds of days. Every single day she's awakened to a miracle. Flour and oil that she didn't buy is miraculously there for hundreds of days. And then this awful thing happens, and immediately it just like short circuits her memory of everything that God did that was good for her. I want to encourage you today, don't let your human tragedy erase your divine history. Here's the principle I want you to understand. Our memories of God's goodness can be fatally short. That's why church is such an important exercise. That's why we need to come here each week, because our memories of God's goodness and His love, of His power, it's just like we just forget in no time at all. Spiritual amnesia just seeps into us, and we start to forget how good God is. That's why church is such an important experience, because this is a time when we are reminded of God's goodness and power. And this lady, even though she's experienced God's goodness every single day, for who knows how many days, when this bad thing happens, she's confused. The story goes on. 1 Kings 17, verses 19 and 20, Elijah replied, "Give me your son." And he took the child's body from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the room where he was staying, and laid the body on his bed. And then look, Elijah is just as confused as the widow. He starts to ask the same questions that the widow has asked of God. He laid the body in the bed, and Elijah cried out to the Lord, "Oh Lord, my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me?" It's like, God, how could you have forgotten the rules of hospitality? Somebody lets you into their house, you don't go and kill their kid. You've caused your son to die. You know, when I look at this, and he's asking these questions, I think there's a principle here for us, because you know what? God never answers these questions. And this is the principle. Asking why of God rarely yields an answer. Asking why of God rarely yields an answer. And this is where so many people get sick, they slip up. This is where so many people end up casting God out of their lives, because they keep asking why when every bad thing's ever happened to them. And you know what God seems to say? Gee, if I could explain it to you, I couldn't explain it to you. You're just going to have to trust me. Do you read in the Old Testament the story of Job, this man who was the richest man in the world, basically, at the time, and he loses everything, his kids, his money, all his possessions. He loses it all, his health. He's covered with these boils, and he's asking God over and over and over, why, God? And God's answer basically is, if I told you, you wouldn't even understand. Just keep it in mind, asking why of God rarely yields an answer. Elijah really doesn't get an answer here. The lady never gets an answer to her questions of why. Look how God says it about himself. In Isaiah 55, he says, "My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts higher than your thoughts." I want you to be clear about this. No matter how close you get to God, God's ways will always remain mysterious. God asks us to trust him, not to understand him. Elijah The story continues, verse 21. He stretched himself out over the child 3 times. Now, this word stretched out, the language conveys that he's touching him kind of joint to joint, face to face, legs to legs. He's laying on top of him. It's not a medical thing that's going on here. He's just trying to get as close to this kid as he can. And it says that he cried out to the Lord, "Oh Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him." Do you know, in the ancient world with Baal, one thing they believed about Baal was that he was a dying and rising god. They thought every winter that he died and he went into the nether regions of the world, beneath the earth. And every spring he came back, and that's why the crops came back in the spring. But they not only believed that he had the power to die and rise himself, the ancients who believed in Baal, they thought that he had the power occasionally to raise dead animals and dead people. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a demonstration once again that God really is in control. That maybe you thought Baal could do it, but Baal never could do it. This lady, she is very likely a worshiper of Baal. She's very likely somebody who, until she's met Elijah, she doesn't know God. She doesn't believe in him. Elijah's asking for an answer, and he's asking for it 3 times. 3 times. You know, if Elijah had to pray 3 times for something to happen, I bet we're going to have to pray a lot more, don't you think? The principle for us is this: don't give up on God. Don't give up on God. I don't know how many times you've prayed, "God, bring health back into my marriage." Or, "God, help me in my job." Or, "God, help my child to come to you." Or, "God, heal me of my health problems." Or, "God, bring life back into my finances." I want to encourage you today, don't give up on God. I don't know how many times you've prayed. Pray it again. If Elijah had to do it, we will too. The story continues, and it says this: the Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. "Look," he said, "your son is alive." Then the woman told Elijah, "Now I know for sure that you are a man of God, and that the Lord truly speaks through you." Isn't that rich? She's a widow in Zarephath, and she knows more about the power of God than King Ahab, who started worshiping Baal. That's rich. God did an incredible miracle for this lady. Now, at first, she thought that God had killed her son because he was mad at her. And Elijah thought God allowed this tragedy to come on her, even though she had invited him into her home. But I want to ask you this morning to just think about this story in a different way. I want you to ask yourself if it's possible, if you go back to the moment where Elijah asked for a cup of water and a piece of bread, is it possible that God knew all along? God knew all along that this child was going to die and that he needed Elijah. Could it be that God allowed the brook to dry up on Elijah so he could pull Elijah into this foreign city, into the home of this widow who didn't even know him, because he knew that the kid would need the power of Elijah? That's what I think is happening in this story. God was invading this woman's life, invading her space, so that he could be close enough to bring life when she really needed it. I want you to think about this. What if she had said no? What if she, in hearing the request of Elijah to give her water and a piece of bread, what if she said, "You're crazy. I've already told God I don't have enough"? What if she, in listening to Elijah, were to say, "Go ask somebody else. Go ask somebody with more means. I only have enough for me. Listen to me. Sometimes God says to us, you know, I know you don't have enough, but I'm going to ask you for everything anyway. Because it's only when you trust me, it's only when you give sacrificially to me that you begin to experience my power in your life. Now, don't get nervous. I'm not going to ask for another offering. But here's the principle. God often asks for something unreasonable from us before doing something remarkable. God often asks something unreasonable from us before doing something remarkable. And I can just tell you, I've seen it dozens of times in my life. I don't have time to go in to all the times when I knew God was telling me to give him something more than I thought I could possibly afford. I thought it was reckless to respond to him like that. Only to find out that actually, that only when I responded in obedience to him was I going to discover more of God's remarkable power manifested in my own life. You know, when you give God everything, just like for this lady, when you give God everything, God will make his home with you. Maybe you've been holding back something from God. Maybe it has been financial, something you've been holding back from God. Or maybe it's some level of obedience you've been holding back from God. Maybe you're holding on to something that you know is sinful in your life, but you couldn't imagine letting go of it. I'm saying to you, obedience, giving everything over to God, that's the answer for you. I don't want you to be in the position where you say no when God comes asking for something unreasonable from you. Maybe he's asking you to give him something that you think you can't. Maybe he's asking you to take a step that actually blows your mind. But God is saying, trust me. Give me what you have. I'll provide for you. Because this miracle of this boy raised from the dead, remember, it started with a dried up brook. It started with a request for a little cup of water. Could it be that God was taking away the brook and taking away the ravens and pulling the prophet into this foreign city so that he could do a miracle for this child? When God comes calling, the question for you and me today is, when God comes calling, will we hold on to what we have and say, God, I'm sorry, but I've only got enough for me? Or when God comes calling, will you answer, God, I'm all in for trusting you. I'll give you everything I have. You know, I kind of love the summer. I love days like Father's Day because, you know, a lot of the rest of the year, we've got more people here. The people who come on a day like Father's Day, you're like, for the most part, really a part of this church. You're really Christians. And so I'm not inviting you as much to say, hey, come and taste and see the Lord is good. Instead, I'm calling you to respond to Jesus' call, which is to deny yourself. Pick up your cross. Follow him. When you give him everything, taken from somebody who knows. When you give him everything, he has a way of giving back so much more.